everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar on scaling SOC 2 for multi-business units and products. My name is Kendall Morris with Risk 360. Happy to welcome you. I did want to point out that in the GoToWebinar control panel, there should be a section for handouts. We have a couple of things in there for you right now, as well as a question section where if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to drop them there. We have a time at the end where we'll be addressing any questions that you have. For now, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Christian to get us started.
Great, thank you, Kendall. Welcome everybody. We've got an exciting topic today for those of you that are scaling your SOC 2 program, and this is our agenda. So we're going to start with some background and context. Then we'll jump into kind of these four big topics that we want to address related to scaling SOC 2 programs: scope and strategy, timelines, the use of internal audit, and then deploying a single framework strategy. Then we'll recap some of the things that we addressed, as well as a few others and best practices for efficient program management. And then we'll demo some of our resources and downloads and open it up for some Q&A. All right, let's get started. One key assumption we want to make, and this is for context, is if you're watching this, you already have a SOC 2 program, and you're either scaling it or redesigning it to facilitate multiple reporting for either multiple businesses, business units, or products. If that's not the case for you, I think you'll still take some things away, but we have other content that might be suitable for early stage programs. So just wanted to give that context up front. All right, so let's start with background. So one of the things I like to do in webinars is frame the problem. Why are we here today? What is the problem that we're trying to address? So really, the problem we're trying to address is the instance when large and growing companies are faced with a lot of regulatory compliance and certification requirements from customers, and they're trying to manage all that complexity. In addition, the company is growing, maybe adding additional companies under the parent company, or adding additional products that need certifications as well, or reporting, and this becomes very difficult to manage at scale. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to manage that at scale and how to think about some ways to reduce the complexity and ultimately make a SOC 2 program more efficient for the team. So these are a few attributes down here that organizations in that category might be facing. They might need to get multiple SOC 2 reports for different reasons. They might be looking at ways to more efficiently manage their program, potentially by consolidating reports, or at least the testing or the way that audits are done. And then there might be, like I said, M&A activities that are driving the increased scope of their program. And there's a few different ways that can be managed. So that's kind of the problem that we're looking at. So some key takeaways is, increased complexity and increased costs. So how do we manage and reduce costs, as well as manage that complexity as the organization grows, as the organization's needs increase? So I think there's some internal opportunities, and that has to do with program design, making upgrades to processes, documentation. There's also external opportunities with your audit partner. And these are opportunities that I don't think are utilized very often, which is why I wanted to address it during this webinar. And then there's future opportunities, such as having a playbook for integrating new business units into your SOC 2 program. Things that if you think through and document now, it makes it a lot easier to scale. All right, so we'll start with a quick refresh for those that are a little bit less familiar with SOC 2, or just to cover some basic facts about SOC 2. SOC 2 is not a security framework, it's a reporting framework. It's governed by the AICPA, where the criteria are defined by the AICPA, but the controls can be bespoke and designed by the organization to meet the needs of the business. So in that aspect, SOC 2 is very flexible and customizable. Examinations are conducted by and reports are issued by CPA firms such as Risk 360. So as a CPA firm, we issue a lot of SOC 2 reports. Sometimes our clients have needs for implementations of SOC 2 programs, which we also do, and sometimes companies will actually outsource the management of their SOC 2 programs to us. Now, we can't audit what we are managing, so we have to do one or the other for those clients, but we have a lot of familiarity with SOC 2 and have been doing that for many years on both the audit side as well as the implementation and management side. SOC 2 examinations may be either a type 1 or type 2 variant and cover security as a baseline, which is common to all SOC reports, but then there's additional trust service criteria that may be added based on the needs of the organization or the expectation of customers, depending on the scope of what is being covered. For those less familiar with type 1 or type 2, type 1 reporting is a point-in-time report that covers the design of controls to meet the SOC 2 criteria. Type 2 covers, in addition to that, the operating effectiveness of controls over time and is really the gold standard for SOC 2. Additional subject matter may be considered or added to the report. So this is something that isn't well known or well publicized, but some companies will want to include some HIPAA security rule reporting in their SOC 2. That is possible, and that can be added to the scope. Additionally, sometimes companies want to add the Cloud Security Alliance's CCM set of controls as well, and that is also something that can be added as additional content to the SOC 2 report. And then lastly, Section 5 of the SOC 2 report is optional. It's not audited by the auditor, but it's an opportunity to provide the reader of the report with additional context and mappings, things that might be helpful when digesting the report. All right, so let's get into the meat of today's content. And this is a little bit more detailed agenda here. These are the primary things that we'd like to talk about. So related to scope and strategy, you can either have a single SOC 2 report that cover multiple business units or products, or you might want to have multiple reports with reduced scope of those reports. And we'll talk a little bit more in depth about why one or the other may make sense even as you scale. We'll talk a little bit about timelines, internal audit, external audit, so your SOC 2 examination, and then other audits that you may have and how to be more efficient with that, which facilitates scaling the program. We'll talk a little bit about the leveraging of internal audit, something that I think is underutilized across the industry, but could be a really good opportunity to reduce complexity and save a lot of time from your team. And then we'll talk a little bit about single framework strategy. All right, so what we'll do here is we'll kind of look at a few attributes on the left and right hand side here where we consider, when may it be best to have a single report with a larger scope, or when may it be more appropriate to have multiple reports with a reduced scope. So I'll just kind of build this slide as we kind of talk through it. But when there's a requirement for a single reporting mechanism, or that's what customers are expecting, often just having that single report is fine. And if the scope is similar, if the products are not too different, sometimes that makes a lot of sense. Other times, it is more helpful to have distinct reporting by business unit or by application, simply because of the way the product is brought to market or the expectations of the marketplace. In the instance where a company might have a set of corporate controls and policies and then product controls, sometimes that can be a good opportunity to have a single report. And where that might make sense or why that's helpful is if you consider, a large entity with a lot of corporate controls, such as maybe those that are operated by shared services, such as human resources, IT, legal. So, areas such as risk management, vendor risk management, governance. Those are often controls that can be operated at that parent level. And then the product controls related to engineering, change management, those would be tested at the product level or the business unit level. So sometimes that lends itself well to having a larger report where you've got controls that are tested once at the corporate level, and then controls that are tested multiple times based on the scope of the different products or business units, where controls may be operated differently or where there's just multiple areas of scope to assess. Where it may make more sense to have multiple reports is if those business units are operating as silos. So if a business unit has their own HR, their own legal, things like that, those would need to be tested as well. So sometimes it makes sense to break out the reports in those instances. I have the asterisk there just as a reminder for myself to go back there to the left side. So for corporate controls and policies, sometimes it still makes sense to break that out as separate reports. And the way that that would tactically be done is the corporate controls and policies would still only be tested once. The product controls would be tested by scope area, but then there would be multiple reporting mechanisms for each of those scope areas. So either one can be done. It's just what makes the most sense to the business based on these factors that we're talking about. Part 3 of the SOC 2 report is what we call the system description. That's where you're describing the system, how it operates, how the reader of the report is interacting with that system, including how they interact, what are their responsibilities as a user of the system. Sometimes that lends itself to more simple reporting when the products are similar. So if you have a suite of products, they're all kind of similar around the same industry. Sometimes that is a great approach to just have a single report. When the product areas are very diverse, sometimes it makes it harder to describe that in the system description. And for the use of the report and the readability of it, often I recommend breaking those reports out. When you have a mature GRC program, that also lends itself to being able to have a single report, whereas those companies with less mature GRC programs where things may still be operated in silos by business unit or product team, it does make it a little bit more difficult, in my opinion, and so multiple reports may make more sense. Similarly, having an integrated management system also lends itself to being able to have that single report, whereas separate management systems would definitely need their own reporting mechanisms. When the company is stable and the rate of change is slow, that also lends itself to being able to support a single report if that is what management prefers. When there's a fast rate of change in a lot of M&A activities, for many reasons, we always recommend breaking the reports out because then you get into the, if you're trying to fold reports in, now you're dealing with multiple different timelines. If you're folding a product in partway through the period, those controls related to that product would only be assessed for a portion of the time. So it does make things more complex, and for that reason, we recommend breaking those out. At the end of the day, there's many things to think about when scaling your program and adding scope areas to a single report versus breaking those reports out. But one of the things that I always ask our clients is, what is a better experience for the reader of the report? Because that's what really matters. If they're trying to read it and they get confused because of the bunching together of scope areas that are diverse, that's not going to be really usable for them. It's not going to be a great experience. And so in those cases, it does make sense to break it out. So hopefully these different ideas kind of give you some thought around what might be a better approach. And that approach can evolve over time based on the needs of the business. All right, let's talk timeline a little bit because timeline is very important, especially in large organizations. And the bottom line up front here is that audit planning and timeline synchronization is critical in order to making sure everybody's on the same page, rowing in the same direction at the same time. And this chart here just kind of gives a brief overview of different things that the business is doing throughout the year that may need to be considered in building that audit schedule. Some of these things are part of the audit process. Some of these things will take out other key stakeholders from decision-making or being involved. So it's important to understand the audit timeline, in the context of the overall organization. Also, a big recommendation, especially for firms that have never done this, is having a clearly communicated audit plan that has the buy-in of stakeholders, as well as publishing and communicating that with a timeline to all stakeholders so that everyone's on the same page going into a year, knowing what will be expected of them and them being able to plan around that. So here's a few considerations that I'm going to build just based on our experience, things that we've seen and things that I think might be helpful in managing a larger program. So in the instance here, we've got internal audits starting in month 1. We want to leave enough time for internal audit to do their work, and have enough time before the external audit starts in order to allow teams to remediate any issues identified. Second thing is, I'll often recommend is if you have an internal audit team and you'd like to leverage the use of internal audit's work for the external audit, sync with your audit partner early and often to make sure that they are on the same page as you. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on how to do that. For remediation, you always want to maximize the amount of time that the teams have to remediate any findings that come up. So instead of waiting till the end to publish the final internal audit report and then give that to the teams, we recommend as findings are discovered to communicate that to the team as soon as possible so that they can validate that and then start working on fixes. And that maximizes the amount of remediation available before the external audit. If you as a growing company have a lot of complex regulatory and compliance requirements and are being subjected to multiple different audits throughout the year, what we recommend is consider adopting a single framework strategy, which can help you better manage a growing and complex program. We'll talk a little bit more in depth about that later. Then ask your external auditor to conduct a single audit. You know, sometimes like if you're having to do PCI, ISO, and SOC 2, you might have your PCI audit in January, followed by your ISO audit in March, and then maybe in June or July you have your SOC 2 audit. So those are 3 separate things with a lot of overlap being conducted at 3 distinct periods of time that really can't be leveraged in a good way. So what happens is, you know, the audit team or the compliance team is forced to do a lot of work 3 separate times during 3 separate motions. Whereas if you have a single auditor that can harmonize a single audit among those frameworks, it's a lot better experience for the team. It's a lot less time, energy, and focus that is needed from the team supporting that. And then here's a big one that I often recommend is driving the schedule with the external auditor versus being in react mode. So what you'll know is you'll know when your window of time is for the audit, but within that window of time, you know, your own teams have different priorities. And so what we often recommend is work with your auditor, let them know when your team is available versus be on the auditor's timeline. All right, let's talk a little bit about leveraging internal audit. So this is something that isn't talked about a lot, but in SOC 2, the SOC 2 auditor is able to leverage the efforts done by internal audit, which can help to reduce the amount of work that may be currently done twice. So basically, this includes not only the collection of evidence, but also the testing of evidence. A thing to note here is that ultimately, the CPA firm conducting the SOC 2 examination has the ultimate responsibility for expressing their opinion. And so they may you know, have internal rules within the firm for what is not allowed to be leveraged from internal audit. So it is up to the auditor's discretion. But that's why I recommend having planning sessions with the external auditor ahead of your audit and saying under what conditions would you be willing to leverage our internal audit's work, and what has to be true for that work to be you know, viable. Setting those expectations, getting on the same page up front can really help to reduce a lot of time and energy needed from your team. A few notes here: internal audits work is disclosed in the SOC 2 report. Basically, it's disclosed that the auditor leveraged and relied upon some of the internal audit's work. Any tests of controls that may be performed by the internal audit team also need to be disclosed. And then those internal audit personnel must be qualified and competent, and their work is subject to review. So bottom line is the CPA firm has to be comfortable with it, but if they're willing to sign off on that, that could be a great opportunity to reduce some redundancies. We talked a little bit about single framework strategy. At the end, I'll touch on this one more time, but I just wanted to let y'all know there are resources available. We did a webinar on integrating SOC 2 into a single framework strategy. There's also a white paper that we built. These are the QR codes for those respectively. So feel free to go ahead and scan those and download those resources. Those can be valuable in reducing the complexity in an organization's compliance program. All right, so now we're going to move over to best practices for efficient program management. What I'm going to do is recap some of the things we talked about, but go into a little bit more depth on those. And then that'll kind of be a good segue into our Q&A, where I've already built some questions that I think are probably top of mind for folks. And then we'll also take questions from the audience. So one of the things that I think anybody that's been a part of a large organization for a while knows is change is really hard. And managing change is also hard. But some of the things that we've learned along the way is that you have champions and you have influencers. So you have those persons that'll, be on your side making the decision. They're pulling for you. They have aligned interests with you, and those are going to be the ones that are going to help you, make the business case for decision makers. You're also going to have certain persons that might not be your champions, but they're influencers. They can either detract from what you're trying to change. They can also be advocates for what you're trying to change. And so identifying who those persons are, circulating and communicating with them prior to any big decisions that are made by leadership is super important and really helps streamline making positive changes in the program. The next is internal audit planning. So we talked a little bit about this, but the key here, just along with change management, is syncing with all key stakeholders and departments from which support is needed. Obviously, you don't want to plan an audit during a major release or when the company may be cycling people through PTO. So just some things to think about here. It's one of those measure twice, cut once type deals. You put a lot of planning up front, and that ends up making the audit year a lot better. The other thing I'd mention here is just the external planning with the audit partner, not only to get their buy-in on if you would like them to leverage internal audit, but also to make sure they understand the best window of time for when your team is available. And I would even get granular down to the weeks. Then once you've done that planning, publishing and communicating the audit plans, both internally and externally, is important just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Our CEO likes to say, you need to tell people something at least 7 times for it to start sticking. So, planning and getting together with stakeholders to get on the same page is great, but if there's nothing published, if there's no further communication and reminders, then often people forget. The third is driving that schedule with the external auditors based upon that shared understanding of that audit window. And that means, having an idea of when engineering is available. If they're available Wednesday through Friday from 3 to 5 p.m., great. That's something you can let the auditor know. You can plan your walkthroughs around this time, but only this time. This is the only time our team's available. And I'll say, as wearing my auditor hat, I actually like that because that helps me to prioritize my walkthroughs, knowing when that team is available. The single audit approach. This is a big one for building efficiencies. Most firms that are full service firms can do this. It's just, it takes a little bit more work on the audit firm to do. but it makes a big difference in the firms being audited. So like take Risk 360, for instance. We are a CPA firm. We're a qualified security assessor under the PCI data security standard. We're a high trust firm. We do ISO 27001. So firms like us can do these single audit approaches. Again, it just takes coordination between the firm being assessed and the assessor, but it's not too hard to do, and it's a big payoff in reduction of time and resources for the firm being audited. We already touched this, leveraging the internal audits work. One thing I'll just note on here that I haven't touched is even when leveraging internal audits work, sometimes the CPA firm will still want to do some light sampling just to validate and reperform some of the work, for specific controls. And again, this just requires a lot of upfront planning, but it is definitely worth it, has a high payoff. Next is leveraging a GRC tool to better manage your program. This becomes even more important at scale as you have different business units, as you have corporate controls and policies, but then you have kind of a parent-child relationship between the corporate controls and the child controls. Sometimes there's even shared responsibilities for particular controls. So managing all that with scale across multiple business units, across multiple scope areas, that gets really tough. And there's some great tools out there. I will say, check out Phalanx GRC. We've made some significant upgrades this year to facilitate single audits. We've also made some significant changes this year to allow the management of a program using a single framework. It's great stuff. So if you haven't got a demo of those upgrades and you're a client, ask our team about it. If you're not, feel free to hit us up. We'd love to give you a demo and see if that's a good fit for your team. The next thing is, when possible, automate evidence generation and collection. So I've heard it said, there's some companies out there that automate SOC 2. Well, no, you can't automate SOC 2. SOC 2 is a program. It requires people's input. However, the collection of evidence in some cases can be automated. And one of the things we did this year as well is build out what we call cloud compliance management. So if you have cloud service providers such as AWS or Azure, and or even Google's solution as well, there's certain evidence in there that we as auditors would need to check based on what the control is telling us we need to look at. Well, CCM allows you to ingest that evidence in an automated fashion so that we're not having to do extensive walkthroughs or collect a lot of evidence that would require your team to pull that evidence. The cloud service providers have largely seen that this is a problem, and they've allowed companies like ours to go ahead and ingest that information in an automated fashion, which again reduces a lot of effort on the internal team. So I can't say enough for having a GRC tool, some way to manage the complexity. And then lastly, creating playbooks here. So 2 points I'll mention on this is, if it's documented, it can be repeated and managed. Sometimes it's by others. You might have to set the mold for how a new business unit is integrated into the SOC 2 program. You might have to do some design of controls or help to educate them on the controls that they will need to adopt. But the better you can document things and create playbooks, the easier it is for others to be able to help with the implementation. And then a hallmark of program maturity really is having documented procedures. So highly recommend that. All right, so what are the net results of going through what we talked about, these best practices in different areas for reducing complexity? Well, number one, it's better resource efficiency. So the compliance team is tackling a lot of different things, a lot of different frameworks. They might even be tasked with going to collect the evidence themselves. That can be really hard to manage at scale. So by using some of these efficiencies, it's going to reduce the burden on the compliance team, maybe even allow reallocation of resources, which is super helpful, as well as stakeholders. HR, engineering, legal, they don't like to be bothered multiple times throughout the year. So if there's opportunities to reduce that, that's fantastic. The next is upgraded and cost-effective systems to support the program. Again, a GRC program or GRC platform will pay for itself many times over in just reducing the amount of effort that the team has to manually do. Documented processes, again, that's the hallmark of a mature program. And then having scalable program management, so having a foundation upon which to build, especially in the instance where the company is growing, adding new applications or products that need to go through the SOC 2 process, or whether it's M&A activities. And then coming back to our intent, our intent when we talked about this up front when we identified the problem is to reduce the complexity and manage and reduce costs. And at scale, these are things that are very important. All right, I'll make a quick plug here. I think this is a valuable webinar that Christian Hyatt has coming up. This is a 4-part webinar series, and this is building a GRC program to comply with multiple compliance frameworks. So whereas some of the collateral that I showed earlier was specific to SOC 2, if you are trying to build out a GRC program, if you're complying with multiple compliance frameworks, Christian gets down into the tactics on some of the things that you will need to be thinking about. So part 1 and part 2 are already out there on YouTube. You can check out our YouTube channel. He covers governance structure and policy strategy. Next week, he's going to be covering on August 3rd the risk management program, and then in October, he'll round out that 4th part with controls, continuous compliance, and automation. So feel free to scan that little dinosaur there and attend next week. Here's a few downloads that may be helpful. Again, Kendall mentioned you can download those at any time during this webinar. And then there's additional resources we have on our website and on YouTube. So we've got a SOC 2 playlist. We try to address a lot of different aspects of SOC 2. If you're new to SOC 2, check out the Learning Center or some of our blogs, and then white papers and ebooks as well. All right, I'm going to pause real fast. We're going to jump into some Q&A. I've got 2 questions that I want to ask myself up front and try to answer for y'all related to what we already talked about. All right, so you talk about this single audit approach. Sounds great. What does that look like? How is that actually done? So I'm just going to build out a few steps here to hopefully give a little bit more context into tactically how you might approach this. So the first thing that we would do is try to define the full scope of audit frameworks and requirements that need to be addressed. In some cases, for those frameworks or requirements where there's just not a lot of overlap, it might need to be 2 separate work streams. But when there is a lot of overlap, it can be harmonized in a single work stream. The next thing we want to do is understand the corporate environment and organizational structure. Because sometimes controls are not one-to-one, sometimes they're not one-to-many, sometimes it's many-to-many. So it's understanding what scopes are we looking at, what are the nuances of the scopes or the organizations that we're going to be assessing, because that's some of that planning that we want to understand and get right up front. Then there's a decision point, to move to a single framework strategy or not. In either instance, a single audit approach can be done, but I will say taking on a single framework strategy does make life a lot easier on the organization being assessed. And then once you've gone through these steps, then there'll need to be some planning sessions. I recommend doing this internally at first, but then also including your auditor on this as well, because you want to create that common operating picture and shared understanding among the internal team as well as with your audit partner, and then also understand timeline. And once that's understood, the auditor can come up with a bespoke request list, take out all the redundancies based on the overlap among different frameworks, as well as based on what is corporate controls and what's in scope. And then the actual execution of the audit would feel like a single work stream during a finite period of time. It's just that instead of having, the SOC 2 team, you're now dealing with multiple experts that might be on the same walkthrough. So the way that we approach it is, if we're going to do a walkthrough on access controls, we're going to try to get representatives from each team. So if we're dealing with ISO, PCI, SOC 2, high trust, There'll be representatives from every team that will be touching those audits, because we want to make sure that we're not having to ask for the same stuff twice, and we want that team to have the collective context to be able to assess against the controls. So it'll feel like a single work stream, but then on the back end, there are multiple reporting mechanisms based on the nuance of whatever it is, compliance reporting that's happening. All right, next question. What does a single framework strategy look like? Again, it sounds great, but all right, tactically, what should I expect? Well, we begin with asking the organization to choose a security or reporting framework that makes the most sense for them. So in some cases, SOC 2 makes the most sense. If you're an international organization, sometimes ISO 27001 is a better fit as a baseline set of controls. There's also some clients that prefer the NIST CSF. So it really is, what do you want to go with, based on your own assessment of the best fit. So that's step one. Step two is then mapping controls from other in-scope frameworks, and then adding unique controls that are framework specific and may not overlap. So the idea would be to get one single set of controls that map to other frameworks. So you first find what is common among all those frameworks or among different frameworks, and then add to that single framework the stuff that is not common to all. So at the end of the day, instead of having 3 different reporting frameworks with 500 controls, it's more like 150 controls, and what is common to all helps to reduce some of that redundancy that you would otherwise have if you're not operating a single framework. And then what we recommend is just focus on effectively operating the control. So if you have a GRC tool, and you're able to assign control owners, you're able to assign periodicity of controls, and you have people spot checking the operating effectiveness of those controls, or if the tool is able to let you know if those controls are operating effectively based on the people's behavior and reporting, then that makes it a lot easier to just focus on managing a good program instead of having to prepare for an audit. Really, any good program should have audits that fall out of the program versus the audit being this, big rush to, get ready for. So for instance, like in a GRC tool like Phalanx, what we do is we have the common set of controls for the single framework strategy. Control owners will upload evidence. They will go ahead and be able to report on the status of those controls. And then when it comes time for the audit, everything's already there. There's no need to do all this extra work to prepare for the audit. It just falls out of the good operating effectiveness of those controls. So that's kind of how we look at the single audit approach, how we look at single framework strategy, and why we recommend those 2 things. So I will pause there. Kendall, I'll hand it back over to you for any questions that any of the attendees would like to ask, and we'll go from there.
Awesome, thank you, Christian. Yeah, like Christian said, the questions are open in the webinar control panel there, so feel free to drop them. We did have a couple come through. So first off, a question regarding the scope of your SOC 2. So for any advice on a multi-geographic location SOC 2 scope? So if you have multiple business units or products that are geographically dispersed around the globe.
Yeah, great question. So when you consider scope, SOC 2 has this idea of what you're assessing is the information system, and that's made up of the hardware, software, people, processes, and data. So I would look at it more from the perspective of is that information system common, or is there a lot of overlap? If they're completely separate things, it might make sense to have multiple reporting mechanisms. But if there is a good governance and set of controls that you could consider common controls or corporate controls, then being geographically dispersed matters less. It just, in certain instances, those controls at those other locations would also have to be tested separately. So, for instance, in the instance where you have corporate controls such as HR controls, we would need to make sure that if those controls were operated the same way in Europe or Asia, but if they're using separate systems, we would need to include those systems in the scope of our testing and sampling. If those are handled completely different, those controls might be different. And if those controls are different, either we would have to test each of those controls the way they're designed, or it might make sense, again, to have those broken out. So geographical dispersion concerns me a lot less. I think you can still do that single report, but some things to think about are separate systems being used, because that will be a factor. Are there separate processes that are followed, in Europe versus Asia? And then how well are those other locations integrated? Are there data centers that are managed by the company that would also need to be assessed for physical security, or is everything in the cloud? So those are just a few different factors to think through.
Excellent. Yeah, we got another question here around, do we have any Excel templates for mapping SOC 2 with ISO 27001 controls?
Yeah, good question. So the AICPA actually publishes a few different sets of mappings, and that is downloadable if you go to the AICPA's website and you search for SOC 2 and mappings. They do have mappings from SOC 2 to ISO 27001, I believe SOC 2 to the NIST CSF, and a few others. The key thing to note with those mappings, though, is those are mappings from SOC 2 criteria to ISO 27001 Annex A controls. So because SOC 2 is a reporting framework, the controls are customizable, you'd get the mapping between criteria on the SOC 2 side and controls on the ISO side, but not controls to controls. So really, those controls are something that your organization would design, or your auditor, would help you design and get to the place where then you could map those, one for one. So that's just a slight nuance. But yes, those are publicly available. And then if you have an audit partner, that's something that they can provide you at the control to control level.
Excellent. And then one last question here. So for the single framework strategy, is this something that Risk 360 can help with directly, or are we primarily focused just on the audit piece?
Yeah, so we do a lot of single framework strategy implementations. When we're the auditor, we can give guidance around how you would approach that. We can have discussions around it, but we're not getting into the tactics of building that. That would be an implementation. But a lot of what we do on the SOC 2 side is implementations and managed programs. So when clients are subscribing to those services, yes, we go ahead and interview all the stakeholders. We do the design of controls. We help to build that single framework strategy, and we build it right in Phalanx GRC. So it's all there. You can assign stakeholders. The reporting piece and the dashboarding is very intuitive. So it makes managing the program very simple.